Hey, so the other night I picked up Enlightenment by Sarah Perry to read, and then the next day, so I guess it wasn't the other night, but the next day it was longlisted for the bookers. But before we dive in to digging in to this book and what I thought about it, hi, my name is Melody, and I am trying to get better at remembering that statistically, not all of you have been here for any length of time. So welcome, I'm glad you're here. On this channel, we talk about books, book adjacent things, and particularly on Fridays, as is applicable to this video, we try to dive in, or I try to dive in to a specific title. Today, as you saw, that title is Enlightenment by Sarah Perry, which you either knew before or now know has also been longlisted for the Man Booker Prize, which I actually was a little shocked by. This book has been kind of flying under the radar in terms of Goodreads reviews, and I feel like Perry is a very kind of divisive author in some ways. I picked this up because of The Essex Serpent, and I enjoyed that book. I have talked about the show as well and how I think that those two are in conversation. Surprise, surprise, because I also talk about book adaptations quite a lot on this channel, but also the style of The Essex Serpent isn't for everyone. It is very Middlemarch in a lot of ways, as I have called it before. It's very kind of lyrical, it's slow, it is historical fiction, and mostly as well, it is a lot more theological than I think a lot of readers, including myself, went in expecting. So that isn't going to be everyone's cup of tea. And I want to make it clear that that is completely okay. Then following up The Essex Serpent, which wasn't her debut, but I have not read her other book. I did, however, read her follow-up, Melmoth. And looking back at my rating of it, sadly, I did not leave myself any notes about that reading experience because I remember being really frustrated by that book. I remember it feeling very slow. It was very episodic, especially in comparison to The Essex Serpent. And so I remember being frustrated at times. However, I look back at my rating and see that I gave it 4 stars. Now, again, I honestly don't put too much trust in the star system in the sense that it's always more complicated. And as I have mentioned before, and part of the impetus for these Feature Friday discussions is being able to dive into the nuances of a text without being simply like, this was this many stars. And I understand the kind of shorthand of the star system, that it is a kind of easy indicator, all of that. However, there is then this conversation about whether the star rating comes down to execution of a thing or enjoyment. And in my own reading life, because that's all I can speak for, it's kind of a combination of the two. And here, I think what I was recognizing was, despite how I was responding to it, the execution was good, there was a thought there, and that more than anything, the language was there. And I think Perry's language really is one of her hallmarks as an author, and I think it carries over into Enlightenment. Because at this point you might be saying, Melody, these are not the books that you just read. These are not the books we care about because it has not been nominated for a major award. What about this book? But I think it's important to kind of understand where it's situated, because in many ways it is calling back to the works before, sometimes more literally than I anticipated. And at the same time, it is a very modern work because it is moving through time, but it starts in the 90s, specifically at the moment or around the arrival of the Hale-Bopp comet. And so this book is kind of blurbed and centralized around this relationship between Thomas and Grace and how they are kind of kindred spirits, and how two specific romantic relationships in each of their lives kind of contribute to a breakdown of their friendship, and kind of tracing this through the decades in these 3 separate parts of the book centered around different comets. But it's also so much more complex than that. And while I marked a lot of quotes from this book, I think the one that kind of centralizes things in the way that when I used to write book reviews on my blog, I would start every review with a quote from the book, because despite the fact that I don't really talk about it on this channel, I really like quotes from books. That's something that I really respond to. And so I've been trying to sprinkle them in a little bit more as well. But the moment, or a moment in the book, that says, let me do some great thing before I die, feels like this kind of centralizing force, as well as this idea that comes up in the third part of the book of us kind of experiencing all parts of our lives simultaneously, that we are in the current moment, but also at some level in the past and the future at the same time. But no, it does not kind of push us full force into string theory, so don't worry. However, something that is evident here in relation to its exploration of the sky, especially in relation to Thomas getting really into astronomy, is this kind of tension that is also so important to the Essex Serpent between science and faith, but also this idea of like the desires of the world or of the flesh, if you want to speak about it in biblical terms, which this book does a lot, especially as we are following a denomination of Christianity within this book for Grace and Thomas in terms of the church that they attend, that is pretty restrictive. And it's very interesting to take these considerations and these internal conflicts out of something where they feel a little bit more organic in something like the Essex Serpent and move them into the 20th and 21st century and our more modern experience. But it's really at its heart toying with a lot of the same ideas in different ways, especially when it comes down to these relationships that are central to these characters' lives and the way that these relationships kind of steer these characters' lives. But these relationships are defined by the fact that they are always out of reach and that they either cannot be acted on because of some barrier of whatever reason, or there is just some force that makes it so it's that way. And in this book, in particular with Thomas, we have a protagonist who is gay, who is straddling this line between the kind of life he lives as a newspaperman and the city and his life in the pew every week, and the way that his life has been really guided by his love of Grace, who kind of came in as a whirlwind in his life when he was on the brink of kind of leaving the church behind. And Grace was born and her mother passed away, and Grace's father was really left adrift in the wake of this loss despite his faith and was always a little distant from Grace. And Grace's aunt gave up her entire life basically to come help raise Grace, and her relationship with Grace didn't really fully build until Grace was older, and Thomas really felt some kind of bond with this child, and Grace kind of kept him in this place. And so thematically, we are really exploring a lot of the same things here in some ways in terms of this moment of change or this precipice of change, which honestly narratively just makes sense. That is where you're going to place a story. And here we have the kind of external circumstances of the scientific marvels that are happening and the kind of way that that reflects these interior emotional journeys for these characters. But with Thomas, you have a man who is in middle age and kind of facing down what his life has been and what it is becoming, as well as with Grace, you have this girl who is coming into adulthood, has been raised very conservatively, doesn't know a lot of the world, and we see that change with the introduction of a young boy, Nathan, who kind of bumbles into their church service by accident one day by breaking the window and kind of cutting Grace in the kind of fallout of that. And then at the same time, Thomas is being introduced to a mystery that will also guide this entire narrative and is the additional piece here. So I feel like there's so much to talk about here, and I'm also going to try and rein it in because I recognize that lately I have been talking a lot and I probably need to be a little bit more succinct. But so we've got this, moment in Essex Serpent. I talked about it as being this kind of conflict between modernity and myth. And in many ways here it feels like the same, because looking back even at the start of the book where we spend the most time in that 1997 chunk because we're establishing everything and the fallout that will happen that will lead to the ripples of the rest of the novel and these subsequent sections. But it almost, I don't want to use the word quaint, and I think part of that is Perry's language. It is very dense, isn't the right word, but it requires you to spend some time in it. It would be easy to get lost in the language at times, I do admit, and it's very interesting seeing this language in the more modern setting, because in The Essex Serpent, it made sense. It felt like it was reflective of the time the book was set in as well. And in some ways, I do think that there has been a change of that language to kind of match the modern tone, but at the same time, her lyricism and the kind of way of the prose is very much the same. And with the writing and with the pacing of that, the fact that it is so internal, it's very character driven, while we have this great mystery that really is at the heart of this, because we are watching Thomas discover this woman, Maria, who was an astronomer in their town in the 19th century, and they are trying to figure out what happened to her. And there is this small town mystery there that also is connected from the very beginning narratively to small town ghosts. And so here we have these echoes that we see in both The Essex Serpent and Melmoth as well, of this supernatural element. And it's very interesting because if you spend any kind of time here, you know that I am really, really compelled by work that has just this hint of the odd. And if you haven't spent any amount of time here, now you know, and you should spend more time here. I would love to have you with us more. But there is this sense of something that's just slightly mystical, right? Talking about that conflict of the mythical and modernity, of science. And so here we have this idea of like what the stars represent in terms of kind of like the theological leanings in contrast to like the science of it. And I don't say in conflict because they're not. And I think that that's one of the really interesting things for me in Perry's work, is the way that she approaches the kind of theological aspects of these books. She strips people down to their barest parts at the end of the day, but there is a lot of grace for the weaknesses of humans in these explorations and just how we interact with faith in our daily lives. Now, I also was admittedly very religious when I was a teenager, and so I don't know how that reads to someone who maybe has had a different journey or is of a different faith in terms of that exploration. But there's just a real nuance to it that I find incredibly satisfying. And it's not an exploration that I read about a lot in my current reading life. And so we have that element. But then we have the supernatural element. And it's interesting because I consider this a lot different than I would something where I'm talking about the supernatural on top of the literary, or just that little bit of the odd if we're talking something like Mariana Enriquez's short stories, which have this kind of permeating danger and darkness and oddness to them, or Kelly Link or what have you, because here we have this supernatural that is active within the storytelling. Here we have in particular Maria, who we see interacting with Thomas and being present in these scenes. But at the same time, like with The Essex Serpent, it feels kind of like a film, and not like a movie film, but like a filter, in the sense that it's such a present, active part of the narrative, but at the same time, as a reader, I feel like I'm always supposed to be questioning whether that is the reality of the situation. And the way that we as readers and the way that these characters as humans kind of interact with the world, rationalize things, the lives they're leading, how all of that is somewhat amorphous, and that there are many interpretations of it, similar to The Essex Serpent, where the whole book, as it's named, is kind of haunted by this threat of this giant sea monster. And we actually do kind of call back to that a bit in the book, because we are still in Essex in this book, and at one point we go to the town that the Essex Serpent takes place in primarily, and see the kind of modern version of that. And there's just something really interesting in that, because it's echoes of this other work that is incredibly popular, or at least known, but it's also this idea of how we exist throughout time, and it circles back to that idea of us existing at all of these points of time all at once. And so the supernatural element of this is just really interesting to me, because it does feel haunted in a way, but not in a horror kind of way. Maybe it's calling back to the ghosts of Jess Kidd in some ways, but this idea that we are always in contact with the past in some ways, or what we can learn from the past, and the way that this past and this mission that kind of consumes and drives Thomas's life after a certain point is physically present in the space as well. And the mental pictures that are painted by those descriptions, I love the kind of evoking of the rustling of Maria's skirts and just the way that she is brought to life. I think it's just really well done. And it calls back in some ways to another quote that I jotted down. I also took a lot of pictures of segments of this book, and the reading experience of this was really interesting because, like I said, the language required me to kind of languish a little bit. And I've talked about that with books before, but I don't know if any of you have ever had this in your reading life. I'm sure you have. But sometimes there are these books that feel like they kind of conspire, or the universe, or what have you, God in context of this book, though, for a book that really engages with the theology so actively, God really isn't invoked as much as this idea of religion, this idea of the communities of church, this idea of how we treat each other. Whatever force is guiding you in your life, kind of making it so you touch certain moments when it will resonate. Those moments that kind of align perfectly, in which you are reading something and suddenly you get to something in that book that resonates so strongly and acutely with something going on in your personal life or in relationships in your own life, whatever it is. And you hadn't or wouldn't have gotten to that point at the same time. Like, I was reading this so much slower than I usually do. I mean, my reading life has been very different this year. So it wasn't a bad slow. It was just I was taking my time with things. Also, there isn't a bad slow. However, I am digressing a lot. Anyway, I got to section 2, and there were some things in that really hit me. And some of them would have hit me anyway, especially in some of the things that were going on with Grace's aunt that reflect some things I've gone or had with an aunt that I loved, and just time being time. But also the way that was hitting me at this particular moment and in this particular time, in a way that if I had read that section a few days prior, half a week prior, when I thought I was going to get to it, it wouldn't have resonated in the same way. And so there's something that's just really magical, I think, when those moments happen. If you've had that happen to you, I would love to hear about it, so I don't feel like I've gone on this kind of random tangent for nothing. But I'm saying I had emotional reactions at certain points of this book, just in the way that it kind of aligned or spoke to my own life in the current moment. I also, though, had emotional reactions to these characters, which is good because it's the characters driving the thing. It's a character-driven novel. It's an atmospheric-driven novel. There is a plot, obviously, but it's much slower moving than someone kind of going in expecting a mystery may be anticipating, so something to just be aware of. But I found myself interested in how I was reacting, particularly to Grace, because I really started to not like her. And I found it interesting because these characters were well drawn in that I believed them as people, and I believed them in their good and in their ill, or in their character flaws. But I felt, especially in the later sections when Grace was an adult, that she was just so frustrating because she was so selfish and mean to Thomas at points, to my point of view, that all ties back to what she views as this kind of seminal moment in her life that we're kind of building to at the end of part 1, which is a much quieter moment than I was personally expecting to be the shift, which I think is particularly interesting as well, because it really is exploring those little shifts, the little moments, the quieter nature of things, and how those little things can have such a momentous impact, the way the little things can shift the heavens or move the heavens or whatever is an actually impactful way to word that, I should say. It felt like she was holding on to this thing and living her entire adult life looking back at this thing from her essentially adolescence, which, to be fair, some of us do. And Grace didn't necessarily have an upbringing that many of us would probably relate to completely, but especially in relationship to Thomas and Thomas's struggles and like his unrequited love that guides his relationship, it felt very selfish. I too would have been calling her a wretched child. However, we were also exploring like this close bond between these two people who at their core were very lost and saw something of themselves in this other person throughout, generations and time and space in some ways, in the way that this book kind of forces them apart in light of certain events. But yeah, toward the end, I just didn't like her. I didn't sympathize with her. She kind of pissed me off. And in the first section, she was a teenager and I had this promise of the future coming. So then some of the choices she made that I thought were impetuous or selfish can be explained by both that stage of life and the fact that the rest of the narrative could grapple with that and we could see her growing and changing or what or who she would become out of this. But instead, those character traits just seem to kind of carry over. But again, like I said, at the end of the day, this book is a character-driven, atmospheric novel that is guided by kind of deep ponderings while also bringing in these kind of supernatural elements that add to the wonder of things and the kind of exploration of the human experience. And again, it manages to really kind of contrast that idea of modernity and myth in an updated format. I will say I was interested. I really liked the kind of use of 3 sections and using 3 comets or the arrival of 3 comets to kind of check in with these characters' lives. And there was some kind of ingenuity in terms of the form in that we would get some of Thomas's newspaper articles and we would sometimes get letters in terms of how the book was written, which was interesting. I felt like maybe it could have pushed a little further. And once we introduced this idea of like time into it, I became kind of enamored with this idea of the structure and what could have been done in terms of time for the structure. But I think that that would have been too convoluted. I think that would have been pushing too far into string theory. And rather, I think the presence of Maria throughout was part of that exploration. And I think in a lot of ways, the presence of Maria is the kind of ingenuity. And I really, really like having her present. I think that that is one of the really interesting things going on in the narrative. And while the language also has these moments of like deep pondering, it doesn't really read as didactic to me, but it absolutely could to some, I definitely think, because it really is kind of teetering on theological musings. We have those moments, but we also have these brilliant pictures that are painted with the prose and these really nuanced character studies that don't hide from the flaws, and we find the transcendent through the humanity there. And maybe honestly that is also on the line of a little too theological. Now, do I think this has a shot at winning the Booker? No. I don't know its odds of getting on the short list because I haven't read a lot of the long list. I still want to read the new Tommy Orange, Wandering Stars, which for some reason I had thought came out last year. That's apparently how long and how short this year have felt already, as well as James, which has been getting a lot of really good buzz, but I need to revisit Huck Finn. My school, when I was in middle school, we read Tom Sawyer and we never circled back to Huck Finn, but I did read it on my own. But that means we had less conversation about it or no conversation about it. So I don't really have a great working memory of that book, and I really want to come to James with more of an understanding of the conversation it's having with Huck Finn and whatnot. However, this is a video talking and diving into Enlightenment by Sarah Perry, which I think we've done a passable, at least, job at. But if you have thoughts about this book or about Perry's other work, please let me know below. I would love to hear your thoughts. But as always, thank you for hanging out and listening to mine. Read something good. Like and subscribe if you feel like it, but also it really helps me out. And yeah,